you.
Yeah, I'm sorry if this doesn't say more than what's on your website, but it's my pleasure this evening to introduce Paula Smithka, who will be giving the presidential address. And it's entitled A Fragile Future, Shattered Truth, Threatened Democracy, and the Need to Protect a Vulnerable Planet. She's an associate professor at the University of Southern Mississippi and has a PhD and MA in philosophy from Tulane University, as well as a BA in philosophy and BS in biology from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. She specializes in philosophy of science with an emphasis in philosophy of biology and social and political philosophy. And Dr. Smithka has co-edited 2 books with Court Lewis and was also his teacher and advisor, as I recently learned. And her present research interests include philosophy of biology, philosophy of mind, and in social and political philosophy, tolerance, mind viruses, and issues in war and peace. Thank you.
Rachel, thanks for the introduction. And I do want to just, say a couple of things of thank yous. I have been honored to be the CPP president over the last 2 years, and I appreciate having been elected to the position. Thank you. Thanks to both Rachel and Court for their technological expertise and their work on organizing this very fine conference that we have attended. And a hearty thank you too to the executive committee of this very fine organization, Concerned Philosophers for Peace. The executive committee works really hard to keep this great organization afloat, and Jen seems to be tireless. She's the Energizer Bunny to keep all this going. So thanks to all of you. And thank you to those of you who are sitting here at the very end of a wonderful two-day conference, but I'm sure you're all tired, and I hope I won't go longer than 30 minutes. So I'll try to keep it at that. So I'd like to begin with a quote. It is possible that we are already living through the twilight of democracy, that our civilization may already be heading for anarchy or tyranny, as the ancient philosophers and America's founders once feared. That a new generation of clerics, the advocates of illiberal or authoritarian ideas, will come to power in the 21st century, just as they did in the 20th. That their visions of the world, born of resentment, anger, or deep messianic dreams, could triumph, end quote. This quote comes from Anne Applebaum's new book, Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. So are we indeed living in the twilight of democracy? Maybe, or maybe not. Let's hope not. Yet the insurrection of January 6th, 2021, when the rioters stormed the Capitol building in the attempts to derail Congress's certification of the election of Joe Biden, and threatening to hang then President Mike Pence, should shock us, I think, into just realizing how fragile our democracy actually is. Though authoritarian streaks are not all that new to the United States. However, we would like to think that, in fact, they are new. I mean, some examples quickly. There was Louisiana Governor and Senator Huey P. Long, the Kingfish, whom historian Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. described as, and I'll quote, the great demagogue of the day, the man who resembled a Latin American dictator, a Vargas or a Perón, who built the nearest approach to a totalitarian state the American public has ever seen, end quote. Then, of course, there was Joe McCarthy, who, interestingly, enjoyed a 40% of the public support, according to Gallup polls, even after the Senate's 1954 censure of him. And the polls showed that George Wallace garnered about the same percentage, 40% of American approval in 1968, with his racism and populist appeal to working class whites. Yet, in my lifetime, Trump's populist appeal, his election, and subsequent undermining of the democratic norms, not to mention his blatant admiration for authoritarians, especially Putin, which ultimately culminated in the insurrection of January 6th, went beyond just about anything I could have imagined in an American president, and certainly defied any notion of American patriotism that I was ever familiar with. Though the guardrails of democracy ultimately held in this case, I mean, Pence didn't give in to the pressure to seek to overturn the election. And there were a few others who actually upheld democratic principles, like Brad Raffensperger, the Georgia Secretary of State, who, despite being pressured by President Trump in the January 2nd, 2021 phone call to find enough votes to overturn the election, or at least recalculate the election results, he didn't give in. Good for him. And there's Liz Cheney, who actually stood up against Trump's big lie and against her GOP colleagues as well, who were attempting to whitewash what happened in the US Capitol. That was her term, whitewash. She claimed that such lies and whitewashing were eroding our democracy, and she wasn't going to go for that. So good for her. But, you know, as a result, she was ousted by her GOP colleagues, right, from her position as House Conference Chair. What's disturbing, however, is that way too many others were not willing to defend truth and democracy, and they were weakening the guardrails of the American system, right, that protect our particular system of government. So I think we should bear in mind the words of Alexander Hamilton from his Federalist Papers, and I quote, "Of those men who have overturned the liberties of republics, the great number have begun their career by paying obsequious court to the people, commencing as demagogues and ending as tyrants," end quote. Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt contend that it's the political parties who are the gatekeepers of democracy. And they say, and quote them, democratic institutions depend crucially on the willingness of governing parties to defend them, even against their own leaders, end quote. But no such stalwart defense is being given by the GOP. As David Brooks of the Washington Post pointed out, actually, in a PBS NewsHour segment, this was on October 22nd, he said that belief in the stolen election is actually now central to being a Republican, that the GOP has essentially given up the basic tenets of conservatism in favor of believing the lie. And Liz Cheney has said that she actually only thinks that only just a few of her GOP colleagues actually believe that, in fact, the election was stolen. Yet they've done nothing to undermine the lie. Instead, they've not only allowed it to spread, several have openly contributed to the lie. But this calling into question the fairness of elections, despite there being no widespread evidence of election fraud, certainly undermines a core institution of democracy. The constant repetition of a lie turned propaganda in media reports or media outlets makes that particular lie appear true. This is called the illusion of truth effect by neuroscientist David Eagleman. They conducted studies showing that simply by sheer repetition, people will believe a claim to be true And this is what's interesting, even after they've been told it was false, simply because they've heard it over and over again. The illiberal ruling parties in both Hungary and Poland, Viktor Orban's Fidesz party and the Law and Justice Party in Poland, used lies and false conspiracy theories to secure their own political power. Of course, we now know, right, these countries are no longer democracies. Here, the Republican Party, having largely espoused Newt Gingrich's politics of warfare, right, that he introduced in that 1978 speech to the college Republicans in Atlanta. So the Republican Party having espoused politics as warfare, and as well having adopted the view that Democrats, and well, frankly, anyone who disagrees with them, are essentially enemies, right? They're the enemy, they're evil. And of course, one doesn't compromise with evil, and one doesn't compromise with one's enemies. This GOP party, once the party of Lincoln, has now become the party of Trump. And the party members will defend their leaders, interestingly, even when he's not president, no matter how dishonest, corrupt, or what sort of impact they have on democratic institutions. And why? It seems to be simply in order to maintain their political power. Yet that is exactly why those who want to see American democracy continue cannot be passive. Despite the fact that we have a current administration which upholds and defends democratic institutions. But democracies don't get overturned by military force all that much anymore. Instead, they erode. How do they erode? Well, the erosion of democracy is brought about in part by shattering truth. In an era of post-truth, objective facts are not as important in shaping public views as emotional appeals and personal beliefs. Lee McIntyre, in his little book, Post-Truth, it's cute, it's a good little book, if you want to take a look at it, points out that the term post here is not being used in the sense of temporal past, but rather in the sense that, as he puts it, truth has been eclipsed. It's irrelevant. Objective states of affairs are now simply subject to interpretation. They are, in Kellyanne Conway's words, alternative facts. And this sets the stage for promoting a false equivalence between truth and lies. We see this in science denial, for example, with the issue of climate change. A false equivalence is manufactured between genuine science and the alleged competing scientific theories. And what the media has done is gotten in the habit of giving equal time, right, to scientific issues, but also, right, anything that claims to be science, and this includes climate change. So there's an illusion that gets created because of this giving of equal time, that there really are genuinely two sides to a story, but in fact, there isn't, there's only one. So in a hyperpolarized political climate where truth has essentially been shattered, the false equivalence between truth and lies sets up the conditions for weaponizing untruth, where the partisan sources can spread false or misleading narratives that, quote, spread in digital wildfires, cascades of falsehoods that move too fast for fact checkers to keep up, end quote. That quote's from Anne Applebaum. I love that phrase, cascades of falsehoods, because it just seems to really capture much of what's going on. So of course, in an age of post-truth, however, even if some people take the time to check out fact-checking websites, they often don't believe them, right? But political parties then weaponize this untruth simply to keep the power, right? To either maintain or secure their party's political power. And the view now is that this power must be kept by any means necessary, no matter what the cost. So while I wish I had time to talk about Poland and Hungary's employment of their cascades of falsehoods, but I don't, I'm going to focus on our set of cascades of falsehoods, right, surrounding the big lie that the 2020 presidential election was stolen. Fascinatingly, a majority of Republicans still believe this. As I mentioned above, believing this lie has become a central tenet to being a Republican. And a survey was conducted from July 30th to August 2nd of 1,552 US adults. And this poll found that 66% of Republicans continued to insist that, quote, the election was rigged and stolen from Trump, while just 18% believe that Joe Biden won fair and square. Interestingly, 28% of independent voters also say they think Trump was the rightful winner in the election. And even more interesting, 3% of Democrats agreed with that. Worrisome, to say the least. Timothy Snyder states in his poignant and relevant little book written for popular culture, on tyranny, 20 lessons from the 20th century, says the following, quote, you submit to tyranny when you renounce the difference between what you want to hear and what is actually the case. This renunciation of reality can feel natural and pleasant, but the result is your demise as an individual, and thus the collapse of any political system that depends upon individualism, end quote. And we tend to think that our American democratic system does depend on individualism. So why is there this seductive lure of authoritarianism? Well, the roots often lie in disaffection of a group of people who basically just feel that they've been left behind by their government. For example, in the wake of globalization, many blue-collar workers, right, are losing their jobs because of the shift in manufacturing processes and the movement away from fossil fuels. Furthermore, they're dealing with stagnant salaries, and when the cost of crucial things like education and medical care keep going up and up, right? And sadly, they realize they're actually worse off than their parents' generation. So these feelings of alienation have fostered a distrust of politicians and the way government operates. The establishment wasn't doing anything for them. They claim we're not even seen, right, by these elitist people. Recognizing and acknowledging the difficulties faced by blue-collar workers partially explains why Marine Le Pen's her success as a political candidate in France. So, I mean, what's interesting here too is it's not just the plight of the workers, blue-collar workers in the United States. This is something that's happening, globally as well. So she made the National Front Party a working class party, and that, of course, gained a great deal of support in France. But this, too, is part of the reason why then populist candidate Trump actually was able to become president because he saw the working class. He made them feel as if he was one of them. Interestingly, somehow, I don't know how, but despite all his wealth, right, and his privilege, not one of them, but nonetheless made them believe so. So he was able to make the disgruntled blue-collar workers feel as though America could be great once again. They were no longer forgotten, and Trump promised to bring back their livelihoods. Well, on which, he didn't deliver, though he was effective in rolling back much of the environmental protection legislation that was hampering some of the affected industries. So this Make America Great Again campaign is reflective of what Svetlana Boym has called restorative nostalgia. Restorative nostalgics, according to Boym, want to, quote, rebuild the lost home and patch up memory gaps, end quote. Restorative, this rebuilding and the patching up, interestingly, includes myth making and implementing nationalist political projects. So these nostalgics are not simply reminiscing about, oh, the good old days. Instead, they want to regain a lost national identity. A national identity that's been stolen from them by someone who, I don't know, foreigners, immigrants, the elites, right? And this fits really well with the creation of conspiracy theories and scapegoating. So for example, you hear people here in the United States like, oh, it's the immigrants, right, who are taking American jobs. They're the ones who are depleting our social services and so on. Such restorative nostalgia plays really well with the public. In fact, it helped fuel the Leave movement, right, in Britain that led to Brexit. I mean, it was extremely successful, actually, implemented over there. So in the hands of politicians, this sense of restorative nostalgia, right, gives that party the power to bend the reality in a cascade of falsehoods that promulgate these conspiracy theories and alternate histories that have strong emotional appeal and that are continuously repeated in the media over and over and again, right? So people believe in this myth that, the national identity is stolen, that we need to make America great once again, like it used to be, whatever that means, right? But what this adoption of this kind of restorative nostalgia does is cement the base of the political party employing it, right? And then pits them against some enemy, the immigrants or the foreigners who have stolen this identity. And all that's what's going on here is this false equivalence between truth and lies. So I think this restorative nostalgia can also be applied in the issue of climate change too. In the past, concerns regarding the environment were not taken into consideration, right? They simply weren't on anybody's radar, essentially. And no doubt those people whose jobs are affected by government restrictions on manufacturing, mining, and so forth, right, long for those days when the industries, when the industries in which they work were unimpeded by government intervention, right? So it's the environmentalists, it's the government that become the enemies of the workers whose jobs are threatened, right, by the push, say, toward green energy, for example. So it's this distrust of environmental scientists and government that tends to be fueled by this manufactured doubt created by the false equivalence between the claims made by climate scientists, who actually contend humans really are largely responsible for climate change, and the alleged competing so-called scientific theories that claim that climate change is just merely cyclical, right? Or human behavior isn't genuinely contributing to climate change and so forth. But the problem, once again, is they're given equal time in the media. So it keeps getting repeated, right, over and over again. Well, I'm going to say Lee McIntyre here cites a survey, and this is from 2013, that of, quote, 4,000 peer-reviewed papers that took a position on climate change found that 97% agreed with the position that global warming was caused by human activity. Yet, only 20% of American adults thought that nearly all the climate scientists agree that behavior was the cause. So what's at issue, right? Climate change is clearly called into doubt. However, in the fight against post-truth, McIntyre, perhaps a little, ideologically in a way, or hopefully, contends that the facts have a way of asserting themselves. So he contends that eventually people will listen when they're most affected. That is, when trouble comes to their doorstep, which, kind of makes sense pragmatically. And interestingly now, perhaps those facts about climate change really are beginning to assert themselves, because people seem now to begin to believe them and are beginning to accept them as true. However, why? It's in no small way because of the climate troubles that are actually coming to people's personal doorsteps, right? I mean, consider the uptick in the number and severity of named storms, the effects of Hurricane Ida recently, for example. Or consider, we just had 2 bomb cyclones earlier this week, one on the West Coast, one on the East Coast. And all those fires, those rampant, horribly destructive wildfires out west, but also right across the globe recently. So finally, we can say progress is being made regarding enlightening and educating the public's views on climate change. And this is backed up actually by a recent Associated Press NORC Center for Public Affairs Research and Energy Policy Institute of the University of Chicago. So their acronyms, right? This is an AP NORC EPIC poll of 5,468 adults, which was just conducted September 8th through the 24th. This poll showed actually that 55% of Americans want Congress to ensure that more of the nation's electricity comes from clean energy. Good. And 59% said that the Earth's warming is, quote, very or extremely important to them as an issue. And this is up from 49% in 2018. Furthermore, of those polled, 57% cited this is good. The voices of scientists have had a significant influence on their views about climate change. Well, that's about time, right? And nearly 51% reported that their views were, quote, influenced by the extreme weather events like hurricanes, deadly heat spells, wildfires, and other natural disasters around the world. It's hit their doorsteps, right? So, in conclusion, these statistics suggest that more of the general public is beginning to take environmental issues more seriously. That's good, right? Yay. It's good for us and it's good for our fragile planet. And what's also good is we now have an administration that considers climate change to be one of the most pressing global issues. You know, President Biden on the first day of office, right, got the US back in the Paris Accords. And he's currently participating, right, in the G20 and the COP26 international climate talks. However, these are small steps toward recognizing the fragility of and the need to protect the planet that sustains us. But we have to remember that even though this is a global issue, we have to bear in mind that these steps here in the United States, right, are simply efforts of our current administration. Yeah, not so much in the past administration. And we need to, I think, be wary and be concerned about future administrations and how they will handle these issues. So, turning back to democracy, our American democracy is also fragile. And sadly, right, in a post-truth era where truth seems to have been shattered and where truth doesn't seem to matter, and what? The big lie and other false narratives, as well as conspiracy theories, still continue to be spread and promulgated, right? And now they're with the backing of political parties, namely our GOP here in this country. And why are they doing that? Again, I think, you know, it's to maintain political power, right? And they're being what? Assisted, shall we say, with so many forms of media that keep repeating these false narratives and so forth, right, over and over again. So, our democracy is fragile. It remains threatened, sadly. You know, democracies tend to be, you know, multicultural. They embrace heterogeneous thinking, and they tend to be pluralist, right? But those folks who seem to be embracing this sense of restorative nostalgia seem to instead want unity of some sort, right? Unity, don't want diversity, homogenized thinking. They tend to be anti-pluralist. They simply want a less diverse America, period. And authoritarianism seems to offer those things. It seems to appear to offer those things anyway, for those at least who want to accept that same sort of homogenized thinking mindset. So, even though the current administration is committed to upholding the principles and maintaining the guardrails of democracy, the violence of January 6, 2021, I think, reveals just how fragile our democracy actually is. And we, the people, have to be responsible and hold our leaders accountable for upholding those guardrails of democracy, and also to combat climate change. Because after all, I think our future is a bit fragile, and we need to preserve the planet that sustains us, and hopefully the diversity in our American democracy. So thank you for your time and your attention. Okay, so I guess we'll take some questions.
Thank you, Paula. If you would like, I can moderate this, and there aren't any
Changing glasses so I can see you all.
there aren't any questions in the chat. I mean, Mark's noted that Kinzinger is not running again. I think that was part of you were listing off things that were happening. But yeah, if anybody has any questions, you can raise your hand.
I would like to make just a side note. It occurred to me afterwards. I mean, I did bring up Nixon and Watergate. I mean, that was obviously, I was pretty young then actually, but you know, that was a time in our history that also demonstrated the kind of fragility of our American democracy. But unlike what's going on now, right, the political parties put the, you know, the importance of democracy and went against the leader and preserved the, you know, they upheld the guardrails. I mean, and it was bipartisan, which was interesting. So unfortunately, it seems, at least to me, that we've declined even from the Nixon era that in itself was pretty scary.
Yeah. I'll add to that. I mean, Lamar Alexander, a Tennessee state senator, when Trump was going through the first impeachment, was like, yeah, I mean, in one of the interviews, I'm paraphrasing, but was like, yeah, I mean, he's obviously guilty, but we're not going to impeach him over this, right? I mean, this is just not, it's just not political. And I think that kind of sheds a light of where we're at, right? It's very political. And I'm going to ask a question since nobody else has their hand raised. I know you're a big fan of popular culture. So I'm curious, yeah. I'm not a Marxist, but I do think that pop culture plays a key role in creating false consciousness, creating these narratives. I know Joseph Orozco's presentation earlier was really good about this kind of Leave It to Beaver narrative that was created, Dick and Jane in the 1950s and 60s. I'm curious, in terms of pop culture, do you see satire being the most effective agent for positive change, or do you see something more kind of couched in that, I don't know, deeper narrative, false consciousness of, we see where we normalize diversity, we normalize compassion, we normalize those things. So I see strengths and weaknesses in both, but I'm curious if you think that there's one better than the other at affecting social political change.
You know, I haven't thought about this, and it would be something I would have to reflect on a little bit further. Sadly, I mean, I think satire in many ways goes a long way to accomplishing the goal. I think, though, the difficulty now is I'm not sure whether many people would get it as satire. I think there's been a kind of diminishment, at least for the general public. I mean, in the sense that I'm not sure how much of the popular culture or consumers of popular culture really would pay attention that it was satirical. Yeah, you know what I'm saying?
It's kind of like Stephen Colbert, right? Do you get that it's satire, or at least the old Colbert show, right? Do you get that it's satire, or do you think he's really a right-wing Republican who's, you know?
Well, the problem is there's so many consumers that look at what's in the media very superficially, that I'm not sure, at least initially, they would get the satire. I don't know. I mean, I'm just off the top of my head here. But satire is, you know, a very useful tool. And I like Colbert. So, yeah.
Paula, I don't know so much of a question, I guess a comment, and then offer it as a response. You offer it to you as you can respond to it. I was interested in the statistics that you cited towards the end of your talk about the increased concern on the part of the American public about climate change. I guess that is a more recent set of statistics about since we've had the hurricanes and the wildfires out of control, and probably it'll be interesting next year to see what the statistics will be after the summer with the heat dome that covered the West and whatnot. But one of the things that I find so terrifying, right, not only with climate change, but also say with the COVID response, is how many individuals cling to the conspiracy despite empirical, their own experience, right? So we have the experience or the stories of individuals lying in the ICU, clearly they're dying and they still don't believe COVID is a reality, right? Or I don't have any statistics on this, but how many fire men and women were on the front lines battling the blazes out west who still did not believe that this had anything to do with climate change or rising global temperatures. And I don't even know what to say in these instances, but it's despite just defying any grounding in reality, right? A personal experience, and people still reject what is actually going on.
You know, I thought about including COVID in all of this too, but I didn't want to go that much longer. I think, you know, I was in the interest of time management, and people are tired. But yeah, what's peculiar, I mean, I was heartened when I saw that poll. I mean, it's still only at what, 55%, 59%. That's only half the nation. It should be much higher than that. I am astounded. I remain completely astounded at the number of people who deny COVID's real, or that it's as significantly life-threatening as it is. Because what are we? We're over 711,000 people, I think, dead. And, you know, now that we have vaccines, so much of this is preventable. And what blows my mind further is that, you know, it's the people, I mean, medical personnel of all people are denying they won't get a shot because they're believing, I don't know, you know, government mandates are bad, though they mandate vaccinations for your kids to go to school for polio and measles and all sorts of things, which I don't understand. But the conspiracy theories, what's problematic with them, and particularly that they keep getting promulgated on social media sites in particular. I mean, I liked Ann Applebaum's phrase, the digital wildfire, you know, it just keeps spreading and spreading. And the more people hear these things, they believe them to be true. It's because, you know, it's created a kind of habitual pathway. In my last address back in January, I talked further about mind viruses, right? And these people have essentially, I think, adopted, you know, they're infected, literally infected by these lies that I don't know how, and that's one of the difficulties. And I had asked AG and I'm sorry, I forgot his name. Jacob, yes, thanks. AG and Jacob earlier, if they had, you know, some suggestions about how to countermand some of this. And I don't. I mean, it's difficult. I mean, in your talk, you talked about individuals doing, you know, their part, you know, to contribute to peace and so forth. I think individuals have to work harder at trying to find more reputable sources, news media sources, to do some fact checking. The trouble is, back when the journalists, when we didn't have social media and it wasn't able to be spread so far and wide so fast, you know, we had responsible journalists that actually maintained the framework for what was, you know, good information versus what's bad information. Sadly, much of that now, and of course you have Fox News media that blends news and opinion, that makes it even more difficult to sort out what the good sources are and things like that. And unfortunately, you know, it falls largely on the consumer of the news media, and people don't have time or the inclination, or, you know, because of cognitive bias and so forth, they don't want to listen to other views. So I'm sorry, that was really pretty, probably roundabout. I don't have, sadly, you know, I wish we had a vaccination to cure the mind viruses that are out there infecting people. And I don't know, somehow bring back some rationality to think important issues, medical issues like the vaccine, or, you know, like the getting vaccinated for the public good.
Mark has his hand raised.
Oh, Mark, hi. Okay.
Hi. Regarding sort of politics as warfare or peace and warfare or self-defense, I was curious what you think about the proposals for court packing and for creating new states.
And for creating, I'm sorry?
New states, Puerto Rico and DC and Guam and et cetera.
Okay. The court packing issue, I think is dangerous in some did you mean court packing in the sense of expanding, like the court? Yeah. I think in a way that's dangerous for the following reasons. It absorbs, or it tends to absorb what should be an independent judicial system, keeping checks and balances on the other areas of government, the other branches of government. And if we start packing the courts, what happens is, you know, you're changing the rules of the democratic game, as it were. And once political parties and so forth, if you start changing the rules too much, changing the rules then, right, contributes to securing a kind of single party rule, which won't fare well, right, in a democracy. So I haven't really thought a whole lot about expanding statehood. I think that in many ways might be a reasonable thing to do for, I mean, so many of, you know, like people in Puerto Rico and so forth, they're essentially kind of disenfranchised from everything that is America, and yet they indeed are a territory, right? If I got that right, territory. So I'm not opposed to that. I haven't really done much research or thought about it too much further, but your thought?
Yeah, I guess oh, sorry. I guess I would say, I mean, I think you can carve out proposals for statehood that are explicitly motivated by generating expected Senate seats for the Democrats. I mean, that's, yeah. So like making DC a state instead of part of, you know, Maryland or whatever.
Well, I think there may be some other, you know, good reasons why, you know, in terms of populations and so forth, that, I mean, I wouldn't be prima facie opposed. I would like to see the arguments and see whether in fact there were good arguments for going those routes. That, you know, one of the big things about authoritarian regimes is that once they're in power, that's one of the things they do is actually change the rules, right? That's one thing that the Law and Justice Party did in Poland, was essentially pack all the courts and change the rules of the civil society and so forth over there. So, I mean, I do think that's really concerning. And if we start changing the rules ahead of time, I mean, if we're changing rules, we need to have very good reasons and they have to be well thought out, I guess.
Thank you. And I'll say my cholesterol is high enough, no more court packing for me. So, but we're about 4 minutes until 7. Sanjay has a question,
Sanjay's got
maybe the
his
last
hand up.
one, unless.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll try and make it quick. I really appreciate everything you brought up, Paula. I appreciate how you have a way of incorporating current events into the work that we do. And I was wondering how you would feel about the notion of sort of emphasizing duties that citizens themselves have. You know, at some point, it seems like you know, we can say a lot of the stuff that happens is the public's own fault. And I mean, given how they keep voting, given, you know, how they keep falling for the same stuff. And, you know, what would you say about duties citizens have and how maybe those duties can be like kind of promoted?
I do think that citizens have a moral responsibility to try to see through this false equivalence between truth and lies. I mean, I feel strongly that so many American people just, I don't know, are so stuck in their cognitive biases that trying to get them to see that they do have a responsibility to try to ferret out what is, you know, what is true versus what is false and what's good journalism as opposed to, you know, crackpot journalism or conspiracy theories. I genuinely think we need to stress that they have this responsibility. And I think, as you know, was suggested earlier, and I've argued this too. I mean, I think education in the lower grades and in high schools, particularly right now, who are for those young people who are going to be voting in a couple of years, I think it really would be helpful to try to shore up that kind of literacy about how to sort through good journalism, bad journalism, truth and lies in the media, and so forth. I also think, though, that politicians really have a moral responsibility to not treat their citizens as mere means, you know, in the sense of having respect for persons in the Kantian sense. When they're promulgating these lies, they're buying into them, whether they believe them or not, for just political gain. People are being used as mere pawns in order to play their particular game. So, I mean, I wish I had some answers, but I do think the public has a responsibility and a duty to do what they can on their own individual part, to not participate and not to spread, you know, the conspiracy theories of QAnon and others.
Yeah, thank you. Because I think, you know, we shouldn't forget that democracy is sort of predicated on the notion that citizens have to do their part as well.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely. And we have abrogated that responsibility, just as, and I think in part that may be because we've seen our politicians abdicate their responsibilities into, you know, keeping what democratic principles alive. they've essentially, many of them have sort of just left the playing field, shall we say, at least in terms of responsibility.
All right, it's 7 o'clock, so technically this is the end. Paula, would you like to have some final words as you conclude your presidential address?
Like I said, it has been my honor, thank you, to have served as president of this great organization for 2 years. And you all are great. And I don't know, I just enjoy being part of the Concerned Philosophers for Peace. So, and I will wish my successor, perhaps it might be Sanjay or whomever.
Wink, wink,
but nonetheless, I wish my successor luck, as it were. And I'll look forward to next year's presidential address that is not my own.
Well, thank you, Paula, and thank you
And thank
everyone
you.
else, especially
Yes,
Rachel
thank you for coming.
for helping put this together, and thank you all for being here. And hopefully, if you've not already done it, you'll join the CPP and
And pay your dues.
Pay your dues. There's a link in the chat, and it's not much. I mean, it's less than. I mean, it's almost less than a meal at most places these days. So thank you all for coming out. And I do look forward to being in person again, because usually this is when we're all like, hey, let's hang out and, really just talk.
Well, there's usually a dinner to follow. After the presidential address, we have some big dinner, and then we have time to, mingle and chit chat and stuff.
Right.
Maybe we'll get back to sharing good food together.
Yeah, good food, good conversation. We do have stuff at the APA Eastern and Central coming up, and I know Pacific too. So if you're going to either of those, or any of those, make sure you stop in or join us via Zoom. I know the Eastern is doing Zoom. I've not heard anything for the Central, but I'll be there in Chicago. And so, yeah, just be engaged. That's one of the ways to do it. So to make change is to be engaged. So thank you all. If y'all want to stick around, I can leave the Zoom open